Purity might seem like a dirty word. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me on this episode. Now, purity, a dirty word, that may seem like an oxymoron, but for some, perhaps for many, the idea of purity and purity culture in particular has led to just a lot of junk. Dirty in your soul. Purity culture drew some black and white lines, and it just brought a lot of shame and pain to people in certain parts of the Christian church. My guest today is one of those, and now she's on the other side helping other people deal with some of that fallout. Dr. Camden Morgante is a licensed clinical psychologist, helping people for something, like 15 years as a therapist, especially dealing with the shame and pain coming out of purity culture for those who have been so affected. She's got just a broad understanding of this from her personal story and from working with a lot of people who have struggled with this. Dr. Camden has released a book recently, Recovering from Purity Culture: Dismantle the Myths, Reject Shame-Based Sexuality, and Move Forward in Your Faith. I just want to say right from the start that Dr. Camden and I share a very similar sexual ethic, but walking through some of the junk to get there, you will appreciate the way of talking about the underlying assumptions, some of the values, some of the psychologically based impacts of certain ways of dealing with religious ideas. There's just some deep thought into the foundation of this conversation, and I know you will find this helpful. Here we go. Dr. Camden Morgante, thank you. This is going to be a fun conversation. I'm just so glad that we have this time, and thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for reaching out and inviting me.
We have something that I think is going to help people, encourage them, perhaps even stretch them a bit. And we're just going to dive right into what for some may feel like a little antsy issues, but if you have been affected by this, you know how big a deal it is in your life, and that's purity culture, and both the damage that some people have experienced there and what coming out of that can mean and look like. I'd just like to give you a moment to say, how did this become something that was so important to you, and how did you come to be where you are now in talking about and writing about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it became so important to me because of my personal experience growing up in purity culture. It was heavily emphasized. I say it peaked in the 1990s to 2000s, which is when I was growing up and when I was hearing all of these messages. And I really bought into it and really subscribed to it and wholeheartedly endorsed purity culture as a teen and young adult. And then it wasn't until I went through some personal experiences myself and then started seeing clients, became a psychologist, that I realized the damaging effects of purity culture. And so I started to just take a more critical view of it, that it's not all good and it's not all bad as a movement, but see it more just with that more critical eye and be able to see how it was harming people's faith, including my own, and harming their sexual intimacy in their marriage and harming the marriage itself. Yeah. And so that was what gave me this passion and interest to speak about it, because I wanted people to see that there is good in God's plan for sexuality, and the sacredness of it. But there is a lot of harm with purity culture and the shame and fear that it brought.
Yeah. I can think of a woman that I have been kind of close to for a couple years. She is in her 30s, not married, and deeply distressed about that, and deeply unhappy with God, because she will say something like, well, I did everything right. Why isn't he bringing me a husband? Mm-hmm. And I just like that to be a segue for you to talk about what are the myths in this movement, this culture, this mental space. It's not just God intended sex for marriage, which I know you and I both theologically agree in the big picture on that. But what's the other stuff that gets hooked into this?
Yes. Well, I feel like that was a quote from my book that she said, that is such a common feeling coming out of purity culture. But first, I want to be clear about what I define as purity culture, because like you said,
Good.
it is not just the belief in premarital sexual abstinence or what I call a traditional Christian sexual ethic.
Hmm.
It is not just that. It is the myths, messages, and the shame and fear that were used to coerce people, young people especially, into making the choice of abstinence. It really wasn't a choice. It was shame and fear was used to try to control you for doing that. So yeah, so I think we want to honor and respect people who make that personal choice to adhere to a biblical sexual ethic,
Yes.
but without the shame and fear. So, and the myths, segueing into that. So, one of them is the fairy tale myth, which is what you said. Your was that your client that said that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, this idea that if I follow all the rules and do everything right, God's going to give me a fairy tale marriage, and whether that's, fairy tale spouse and just a happy sex life in marriage. And that was the one that affected me the most too, when I
Mm-hmm.
found myself heartbroken after a relationship ended in my 20s and then single for many years. I didn't get married till I was almost 30, which was much later than my peer group. And then in the culture kind of in the South here and that I was raised in, and then Christian culture, much, much later than the norm. And so I felt like your client did. I followed all the rules and did everything right. Where is this reward I was promised, which was a
Yes.
husband and a marriage? And so it led to a lot of anger towards God, as you said, and this disillusionment in my faith. I've even had clients and people who I interviewed for the book say, kind of, what's the whole point of our faith then?
Mm-hmm.
Like, our faith is really built on these like false promises of prosperity, the prosperity gospel, rather than a genuine relationship with Jesus. So that one can really damage our faith. The spiritual barometer myth is this idea that we're better Christians or more spiritually mature if we are virgins before marriage. And while there might be some truth to, and definitely some value in adhering to God's plan for sexuality, it came along with a lot of pride, ugly
Yes.
pride, and judgmentalism towards others. And so I share in the book, that this one affected me too, that there was a sense of identity and pride and value in my sexual purity, and then judging others who didn't adhere to those same kinds of standards in just a really prideful and ugly way. So that's the spiritual barometer myth. The next one is the flipped switch myth. This idea
Yes.
that once you get married, you just flip a switch and sex is going to be instantly amazing. This is one that was literally taught to us, not just implied, but quotes from books of the 90s and 2000s that I quoted in my book were, if you wait, God will give you an amazing sex life. Sex will be amazing. There was no talk of sex education or preparation or communication or just, the hard work that goes into any skill in marriage or just any
Yes.
relationship, that it's kind of a lifelong skill that you're going to cultivate and create together in your marriage. There was no talk of that. There was no preparation or sex ed. And so that led to a lot of disappointment for couples once they did get married and found that it was much harder to flip the switch than they thought.
Yes.
Yeah, and that they may have suffered sexual pain that prevented them from having enjoyable sex, or just mismatch in libidos or in their sexual pleasure. So that one affects a lot of the sex therapy couples that I work with. The gatekeepers myth is one that is built on a lot of these gender roles and rigid gender stereotypes, that women are the gatekeepers of men's
Mhm.
sexuality. Prior to marriage, they're the ones responsible for monitoring how far is too far and kind of putting on the brakes, the
Yeah.
boundaries, and then afterwards, after marriage, for being sexually available to their husband to meet his needs. And I find that this one really hurts men and women, because for women, it's disowning their own sexual desires and pleasure.
Hmm.
Sex is just for him. And so they've really lost touch with their own sexual desire. And for men, it can often set up an entitled and self-serving view of sex.
Yes.
That she is here to meet these sexual needs, that I need sex in order to feel connected, rather than working on holistic intimacy in all forms, emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy included. Yeah, just this very narrow and rigid definition of intimacy is just intercourse.
Yep.
And then the last one is the damaged goods myth, which I say is probably the most harmful one, because there's so much shame that is taught to people who go too far sexually, who have premarital sex, or even who are sexually abused, that they are
Yes.
now damaged and broken, and they don't have a whole self. They just have pieces to give to their future spouse, or that they've created soul ties to someone for the rest of their life. Like there's just so many harmful analogies and images that were used to illustrate the damaged goods myth. And so those images really stick with people. And that's why I think this can be one of the most damaging of the five myths. So yeah, so those are the five myths of purity culture that I spend a chapter on each of those in my
Yes.
book.
I'd like to drill down on a couple of those. One is the identity idea that if you are adhering to what purity culture said you're supposed to do, not engage in sexual activity out until you get married, that it says something about who you are as a person, and it also goes on the other on the other side as well. Identity is such a big deal in our culture today, outside of the Christian church as well. The idea that my sexuality defines me,
Mm-hmm.
even outside of the purity narrative. And I think the identity trap or myth, phrased this way in the purity culture paradigm, it's a really, really big deal. And I have seen that be really hard for people to break out of that, because it's an assumption that it's just it's almost got into our bodies. We feel
Mm-hmm.
like it's in our DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I said that for me, my spirituality was built on this idol of virginity, and it felt
Yes.
like I couldn't have one without the other. And it gave me this identity, purpose, and value, like I
Yeah.
was more valuable because of it. So instead of having your identity based in your identity as a believer in Christ and as an image bearer, and your value coming from that and from, the God, the salvation that we've received from God, it came from my own works, which, yeah, I don't believe is biblical. And so, yeah, and so, I definitely don't think the judgment of others as then they're the damaged goods.
Yes.
There's the flip side of that myth. I don't think that that is biblical either. That Jesus never looks at us as broken and damaged and just like this chewed up piece of gum. That was one of the illustrations used. But yeah, that he doesn't look at us and just see those like the filthy sins. He sees his beautiful child of Christ.
Yeah. And then I want to talk for a minute again about the struggles in marriage for women,
Hmm.
but also men that
Hmm.
come to marriage with this paradigm. I perhaps it's in part because of my OBGYN history, but then now in the intensives and retreats we're doing with women, so many come into marriage. And whether it's the physical pain or the emotional struggle to connect,
Hmm.
it's like there must be something wrong with me because I'm not connecting in this way. Or men that are deeply, deeply frustrated because my wife isn't doing this, whether or not they butt into the entitlement, which I think can be so damaging.
Hmm.
But it affects both men and women in this expectation that then doesn't pan out to be true.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that as an OBGYN because whenever I go for my checkup, I
Yes.
always talk to the provider about this issue because I want to make sure that they're all like knowledgeable that religion can be part of one of the causes of vaginismus or genitopelvic pain disorder. That religion can be a contributor to that because it's not just a purely physical
Mhm.
condition. And so when I learned that in grad school, I remember that was just like baffling to me. I couldn't conceive that religion could harm you sexually because all I'd been fed was this like prosperity gospel of purity culture. But now I see it in my practice because I work a lot with young women who are newly married and who are either having sex so bad that it prevents intercourse, like they
Yes.
can't even have intercourse, or it's just very painful and uncomfortable. And so the treatment for that is like a combination of like pelvic floor physical therapy usually, and then the psychological treatment. But yeah, they weren't expecting that because of the flipped switch myth. But sometimes it's caused because of that fear. It's the body's like fear
Yes.
response.
Yes.
And I think it can be tied to that loss of identity too, because I've had young women say like, well, I was a virgin and this gave me so much like self-worth and now I'm not. Like now I'm married and I'm not a virgin. Like am I impure now? And so I think that
Yes.
that can affect the way that their body reacts and responds physiologically to sex too, of just with that pain response. So yeah, so that's one of the ways I see it affect women in their marriage. Yeah.
And then a minute more about how these myths impact men as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know you referenced the Toxic Masculinity book, and we had I'm blocking on the author's name right
Zachary
now.
Wagner, non-toxic
Yes,
masculinity. Yeah.
yes. I was able to speak with him about
Good.
his ideas in that, and that was a great conversation. We'll link to that
Oh,
in
good.
the show notes. But talk a little bit about how this impacts men too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he has a lot to say in his book. So I quoted him several times. He did good work with that book. But yeah, the main things I see in my practice with men are the sexual entitlement, unfortunately, that can sometimes happen in marriage and just that narrow view of intimacy that they have really been robbed of the opportunity to develop some other communication and intimacy building skills because all of the emphasis has been put on sex. Like this is a need for you. This is the way that you feel loved and close and connected, is
Yep.
giving and receiving sexual, pleasure with your wife. And once you're married, she's always going to be there for you to get those needs met. And there's no consideration of the mutuality
Yeah.
of sex and of her needs, sexual or physical or otherwise. In fact, I argue in my book that sex is not a need because it's not a physiological need. It's a desire or a want or a drive. And it's one way, but not the primary or certainly not the only way to give and receive love in relationships either. And so I think men could really benefit from expanding that definition of intimacy and also developing some other skills for how you connect emotionally and spiritually with your wife. Yeah, so that the emphasis and the need is not just put on sex. And also being attendant to her experience, her pleasure, her desire, and yeah, that it's not just all self serving. So that's the main way I see it in. But certainly there can be other issues like sexual and pornography addiction
Yep.
for men can be common, especially because sex has just been so taboo and so stigmatized. And that spiritual barometer myth that for women can tie our virginity up with our virtue. I think, for men, their kind of spiritual maturity and virtue can be tied to pornography use and masturbation and things like that before marriage. And so, yeah, there's just so much emphasis put on sexuality as like that's the only thing that matters
Yes.
in your spiritual walk.
Yeah. You've alluded to this a couple times. You said you experienced it, and you've described that others experienced this. How this is can be very tied to faith, and you've
Hmm.
alluded to the idea that well, if following these sexual rules isn't going to give me a happy married sex life, what's the point of all of it?
Hmm. Hmm.
It can deeply impact a person's relationship with God. Would you talk a little bit more about maybe what that looked like for you and then what you're seeing with the people that you work with as well and the impact on relationship with God?
Hmm. What it looked like for me was just an intense struggle for many years with being single, a lot of shame about being single. There's so much emphasis tied up in marriage and the nuclear family in the church. That like I said, being in my late 20s and then getting married at almost 30, like that was old, and that there was something wrong with me is what it felt like. And that I was undesired and undesirable because I was single. But there was, yeah, also the sense of I had one interviewee say, I upheld my end of the bargain, but God didn't uphold his. Like this was an agreement and a bargain and a contract we signed. And why should we do everything right if God is not going to uphold his? Which is just bad theology,
Yes.
And that, yeah. And purity culture kind of dangled this carrot of this promise of marriage and great sex in order to try to coerce young people to make this choice instead of really emphasizing the deeper issues of a faithfulness to God and your own personal sexual ethic that's rooted in your theology and values and faith. And just, I feel like it did us a disservice because then I have clients in their late 20s, 30s to 40s who are single and
Yeah.
really are very confused about what their beliefs are because it's always been handed to them very black and white, and they've never had to do the work of discerning it for themselves. And so then they're lost and they're trying to navigate today's dating world. I don't envy them, just trying to navigate today's dating world and how sexually charged it is, and all the while doing it while they're so confused about their own sexual ethic.
Yeah. You've also mentioned shame several times, which is such a big deal. Let's start talking a pathway out of some of this. And you do a beautiful job in your book about helping people think through some of these underlying assumptions and their own experience and choices. But talk a little bit about the shame itself and what it can look like to break out of those chains around sexuality.
Yeah, I call shame the universal experience of purity culture because I see that it affects everyone, whether you're male or female, unmarried or married, whether you waited until marriage or not. There is so much shame
Mhm.
um, inherent in purity culture. And so healing that is a long process of first being able to
Yeah.
recognize it in yourself and being able to deconstruct those messages that feed the shame, like I'm damaged goods, or like my sexuality is dirty or broken. Yeah, or there's something wrong with me for being single, like all of those messages. It starts with deconstructing those, and then really rebuilding a healthier belief system that's based on a healthy theology and our values rather than purity culture's myths. So, yeah, and then shame is, I give some different psychological techniques in the book, like self-compassion, as a way to heal shame, and then also the importance of connection with others and receiving empathy from others, which comes from Brene Brown's work. Yeah, so there's some different
Mhm.
techniques for helping with shame, but really I think it comes from changing those beliefs and then viewing yourself differently and knowing that I am still loved and accepted and acceptable to God, regardless of my past or what I've done or haven't done, that I am still unconditionally loved.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the importance of connecting with others. I know that can be a big hurdle for some that are feeling a lot of shame. Shame tends to make you want to hide. So just the step of reaching out and connecting with somebody like you, for example,
Hmm.
or telling your story, having somebody else give you feedback, and reflect back to you, that these are things that can be brought into the light, and that's how you disinfect shame, being such a big part of that journey out.
Hmm.
Uh, this kind of gets close to something I know you care a lot about, and that's the mind body connection too.
Hmm.
That often our faith has been presented as a list of propositional truths that you believe and behaviors you adhere to, but
Hmm.
my body is something that's bad and I just kind of need to leave it behind.
Hmm.
I don't believe that's the picture of the Bible. Would you just
Hmm.
talk a bit about how our physicality plays into this journey?
Yeah, so that's the journey of becoming embodied, that I am a body and that my mind and body, heart and soul are all connected, and not disowning one part over the other. And yes, I agree with you that faith has been reduced to a set of checklist of actions to take and beliefs to subscribe to, versus this embodied experience, that God cares for and ministers to our bodies, and wants healing in our bodies. So a lot of the healing for purity culture is restoring that mind body connection. And that looks like starting in the mind with those new beliefs, but having an embodied experience of those new beliefs. So I tell my clients it's not enough to just know that these were myths and know what the truth is and be able to cognitively state that. You really have to have an embodied and emotional experience of the beliefs for it to make that full and integrated change. And so that can look different for different people. It could look like reaching out for connection, like we just talked about, like experiencing the connection of a group or a therapist or even just a friend who says, yeah, I experienced that too, or I know what that feels like, or it makes sense that you feel that way, and just takes away some of the shame and stigma from what we're experiencing.
Yes.
Or it could look like experiencing sex differently in your marriage than what your former beliefs said. So, a lot of times for my female clients, that's experiencing sex as for them too, focusing on their pleasure and experience, being able to tune into their desire. They'll say, what? Like I have sexual desires? They had never even considered that they would have desires and that they could initiate sex or say no to sex based on their desires. Yeah, so having that new experience of saying no or initiating sex on the other hand, and experiencing that as safe and healthy and good, that is the embodied experience that helps to make that change in your beliefs.
Yeah. Um, you have yourself described how you walked through disentangling those myths and the impact on your faith, and deconstructing and reconstructing, and that's the framework you use in your book, um, specifically about rebuilding a faith that is coherent.
Mm-hmm.
You describe how you did that and ended up with the same sexual ethic in the big picture, that God intended sex within covenant marriage, and
Mm-hmm.
engaging in sexual activity outside of covenant marriage is not the way God designed things to be.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to know a little bit about how you came to that, because I certainly know there are people who might be saying, this is just so damaging, I'm throwing out everything.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of the um, just I don't know, unique things about my book, or just one of the things that might make people puzzled, is how I can write a 250-page book about how purity culture is damaging, but still adhere to and believe in a traditional sexual ethic. And I'm clear about that. I don't spend a lot of time in the book describing how I came to that conclusion or why, because the purpose was not to convince people or argue for it, or I really wanted to more so lay out, like, here's kind of the process or steps that you can take to reconstruct your sexual ethic, and leave it more open-ended to what conclusion they might come to, even if it's one I disagree
Yep.
with.
Yep.
But personally, a lot of it for me was coming back to what are my values even outside of religion. Some of my clients don't even realize that there can be values outside of religion. But other people will say, outside of morals, like I still want to keep sex for marriage because marriage provides the safety that I need and the trust and the commitment level that I need in order to express myself sexually. So there, in that, you can hear, these values of safety and trust and commitment. And so looking at our personal values is one way. But a lot of it came to my theology. So I list several categories in the book of theologies to explore, for people to explore, because it's not just as simple as don't have sex before marriage. The belief comes from my theology about the body, about who created sex and why, about marriage, about sin and grace, and there's just so many theological foundations that form that sexual ethic for me. But a lot of it really boiled down to my belief in the covenant of marriage, and that the covenant of marriage is a way to express God's unconditional love for the church and for his people, and that sex is an expression of that love within the
Yes.
covenant. So for me, it was, you can't have sex without the covenant. So, so wanting to have that covenant in place first, and then sex is just the symbolic expression of that. That's what it came down to for me. But yeah, for others, there might be some other part of their theology that it really comes down to, or that really provides that foundation for them, or even, like I said, a non-religious value. But it's important that people take the time to explore that on their own, I think. Like, I really want people to feel the empowering work of reconstructing their sexual ethic and their beliefs and doing that journey of reading and thinking and discovering for themselves. And so I'll provide resources or recommendations to people on other books they can read that are more theologically based and that will give more of that perspective than mine does. But really, I want them to spend some time in prayer too,
Yes.
and seeking what God wants for them. And some of my clients have even more strict or stringent boundaries or sexual ethics than I would say, and some come to very different conclusions and feel confident and comfortable with that. And yeah, for me as a therapist, it was really about leaving space for people to take that journey on their own. But I respect that process for people, and I wanted them to be able to respect my process, even if they didn't come to the same conclusions too.
Yeah. I was talking with a young woman yesterday in her 20s who is in a new dating relationship. And she and her boyfriend are both Christians, and they've started to have conversations about what is our sex life going to look like because we are followers of Jesus. And she was asking me, how do I think about this? And I'm really glad that you talk about values, because if it's just going to a checklist, this is right, this is wrong, and I tell you where the black and white line is,
Mm-hmm.
these are very emotional things. And that kind of just factual, my audience is used to me saying left brain stuff. Just that information is not usually adequately helpful when emotions
Exactly.
are really heated, when you are in the middle of something that your body is going in a certain direction, or your emotional temperature is really hot. So getting to what are your personal values and what are you going to base your decisions on,
Mm-hmm.
more than telling you this is the decision I think you should make, which I didn't tell her. I was talking with her about her values, and I think you've done really well in pointing that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I call that having a deeper why.
Yes.
And purity
Yes.
culture never gave us the opportunity to develop that or to discover that for ourselves. And so, just like you were saying, it doesn't really adequately prepare people for those moments of passion. I
Mhm.
also felt like it didn't provide that deeper why that was sustainable beyond like teenage and young adult years. And so,
Yes.
so when I was still single in my late 20s, or for people who are single into their 30s and 40s, like the reasons that purity culture gave us just like aren't going to apply anymore, or just like are very shallow. And so that's why you need the deeper personal reason rooted in your faith and relationship with Jesus in order to sustain you.
Yeah. You mentioned an idea that I thought was um, unexpected, and that is seeing chastity as a spiritual discipline. Would you describe what you mean by that and what you see as chastity? And the way you present this is this isn't just for teens and 20 somethings, this is a lifelong spiritual part of following Jesus.
Yeah, I got that idea from Lauren Winner, who's an author that wrote about spiritual disciplines. Just this idea that chastity is a spiritual virtue or discipline, and that it is lifelong. It doesn't end in marriage. And so,
Mhm.
chastity, like for me, I could use that as another word for traditional sexual ethic. That because that's my belief, that is a lifelong pursuit. So whether that's abstaining from sex before marriage or whether that's sexual faithfulness in your marriage, and that doesn't just mean not cheating on your spouse, that means treating them with
Yes.
respect and with faithfulness and with mutuality and, just as a full holistic person.
Yes.
Yeah, so that does not end in marriage, and that's what can continue to be practiced. And again, that's kind of the black and white perspective of purity culture of like before marriage equals bad, after marriage equals good. Whereas I'm like, actually, after marriage, you can still be impure. If you're treating your spouse with coercion and manipulation, you're using them, you're treating them like an object. Yeah, you're punishing them if they don't have sex or any of the above. I think that's also impure and fails to meet God's heart for sex. So yeah, so I think that reframing of chastity as a lifelong spiritual discipline can help us also see the purpose past marriage.
Yeah. Good stuff. Would you just invite people to check out your book, where they can connect with you online?
Okay, sure. Yeah. The book is Recovering from Purity Culture. So it's available, of course, on Amazon. Baker Books is my publisher. So I'd love for people to check that out. And then my website is drcamden.com. And I'm on all the socials at Dr. Camden and Substack as well. If people are on that, it's like a blog, newsletter. A platform. Yeah. And so, yeah, people can, if they want to work with me, I offer coaching online for women or couples. If they want to read my work. Yeah. Or just check out any of the podcasts I've done.
Well, we will definitely have links in the show notes. So check that out, people. If you're watching under this video or if you're listening in the audio show notes, thank you. This has made us think, I think some helpful and, in my opinion, very God-honoring ways, getting to the matters of the heart around sexuality and relationships. I thank you for the work that you do and who you are in helping us process all of this. This has been delightful.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Carol. Thank you for your heart, too, and wanting to have these conversations.
We've got all the links for you, folks. Under this video, we have the link to Dr. Camden Morgante's website, to her blog, to her socials, and to her book, Recovering from Purity Culture, Dismantle the Myths, Reject Shame-Based Sexuality, and Move Forward in Your Faith. Worth checking those things out. I hope you do. I referenced once or twice during our conversation about individuals that I work with. And I just want to let you know, if you might be interested in finding out more about that and some of the resources we offer at Dr. Carol Ministries. Yes, I do individual coaching with people also who are interested in that. And our in-person small group intensives. We've now been doing this for about a year and a half, and it's been amazing to see the kind of healing and transformation and freedom that people experience after coming through one of our small group intensives. We've got the link to that under this video also, drcarolministries.com/intensives. I know, thinking about something like this, a 3 to 4 day experience where you go there, you talk about the hard places in your story. I know thinking about doing that can maybe unnerving for you a bit. But everybody who comes has told us that just the goodness, the freedom or the joy or the transformation or the healing that they experience is so significant. To watch people's faces from when they first arrive to when they are ready to leave 3-4 days later, just those few days of bringing things into the light and experiencing Jesus coming into your story, it can make all the difference in the world. So check that out as well. I would love to hear from you, whether it's a comment about this conversation or any of our episodes. You can leave me a confidential message at drcarolministries.com. Use the contact page there. Or you can leave a message under this video, and I read every one. Won't you tell somebody else about our channel, our podcast, our program here? Make sure you're subscribed so you get our material every time, weekly, we put something new up. And now, until next time, may God bless you.